If you're hearing this right now, it's because you almost missed what was meant to reach you in this exact moment, and something deep inside you already knows that. Not because something dramatic just happened, but because of how quiet everything has been lately, how even your own thoughts feel louder than the world around you. You've been moving through your days in a way that looks normal from the outside, waking up, answering messages, doing what you're supposed to do, but at night it's different, when the room gets still and the only light is from your phone screen, and you realize how long it's been since something truly felt clear. You might not call it anything spiritual, but you can't ignore that strange weight in your chest that shows up when everything finally slows down. It's the kind of feeling you don't explain to people because there's nothing obvious to point at, no single event, just a quiet accumulation of moments that didn't go the way you expected. You thought certain doors would open by now, you thought certain conversations would resolve themselves, you thought certain questions in your mind would stop repeating, but instead they stayed, not louder, just persistent, like they were waiting for you to finally notice them. And there were moments, small ones, almost forgettable, where you felt something trying to get your attention, like a sudden pause in your thoughts right before you checked your phone, or a strange calm right after you decided to give up on figuring everything out, or the way a memory from years ago suddenly came back for no reason at all, not as nostalgia, but as if it was placed there at the exact right second. You didn't think much of it at the time, because life keeps moving, and you learned to keep moving with it, even when you felt slightly disconnected from where you thought you were supposed to be by now. There was a moment recently, maybe you didn't even realize it mattered, where you sat in your car longer than usual after parking, just staring forward, not tired exactly, just paused, like something in you refused to rush into the next thing. And in that pause, there was no voice, no sign, nothing dramatic, just a sense that you weren't as far off as you thought you were, even if nothing around you had changed yet. That's what makes this different from everything else you've scrolled past, because it doesn't feel like information, it feels like timing, like something aligning in a way you didn't plan for. You might still feel uncertain, still carrying questions you haven't said out loud, still wondering why certain things had to take longer than expected, but there's also that quiet part of you that didn't fully give up, even if it stopped expecting answers on schedule. And that part is the one this reaches first, not with noise, not with pressure, but with the strange recognition that sometimes silence isn't emptiness, it's just something unfolding without asking for permission, and you're only now close enough to notice it. The next morning does not feel like a reset, it feels like continuation of something you cannot fully name, like your thoughts never truly stopped running even while you slept. You wake up with that same quiet heaviness sitting behind your eyes, not sharp enough to call pain, but present enough that you notice it before you even reach for your phone. The room is ordinary, the same walls, the same light coming through the blinds, the same small sounds from outside, but your attention does not settle into it the way it used to. You move through the morning in a familiar pattern, getting ready, making coffee, checking messages you already expected would not change anything, and yet you still check them, almost out of habit rather than hope. There is a moment while standing in your kitchen, holding a warm cup in your hands, where you just pause longer than usual, staring at nothing specific, like your mind is trying to catch up with something your life has already been saying for a while. You tell yourself it is just fatigue, just stress, just too many things happening at once, but even that explanation feels incomplete, like it only describes the surface and not what is underneath it. Later, while driving, you notice how often you are on autopilot, taking the same turns, seeing the same streets, but feeling slightly removed from them, as if you are watching your life instead of fully inside it. At a red light you catch yourself thinking about conversations you never finished, decisions you postponed, opportunities that almost happened but did not, and it is not regret exactly, more like a quiet awareness that something in your timing feels off, like you arrived slightly before or slightly after the moment that mattered most. You remember a specific evening recently, nothing dramatic, just sitting alone after work, scrolling without really seeing anything, and suddenly feeling the urge to stop, not because anything demanded your attention, but because everything started to feel strangely meaningless in that exact minute. That feeling passed quickly, like most feelings do, but it left a trace, and now you notice more of those traces in different places, small interruptions in your routine that do not fit a clear explanation. Even conversations with people feel slightly different now, like you are present but also partially observing yourself from a distance, responding correctly but not fully connected to the ease you used to have. And still, you keep going, because that is what you have always done, but there is a growing awareness that going forward does not always mean moving inwardly in the same direction. At night, when everything slows down again, you notice how your thoughts begin to circle the same questions without resolution, not louder than before, just more familiar, like they have been waiting for you to finally stop ignoring them. And somewhere in that repetition, there is a subtle shift you cannot fully describe, a sense that nothing is randomly repeating, even if you cannot yet see the pattern it is forming. By the third day, the feeling does not fade the way normal thoughts are supposed to fade. Instead, it settles deeper into your awareness, not heavier, just more present, like something you cannot unnotice once it has been noticed. You find yourself catching small pauses in your own behavior, moments where you stop mid-action without a clear reason, like your mind briefly steps out of sync with your routine. It happens while you are doing ordinary things, like standing in line at a store, sitting in traffic, or waiting for a message that never really changes anything, and yet you still wait for it. There is a specific moment in the afternoon where you are sitting in a parked car for a few extra minutes after arriving somewhere you do not even feel eager to enter, and instead of moving immediately, you just stay there, hands resting quietly, eyes forward, as if your body arrived before your thoughts did. In that stillness, there is no clear answer forming, no voice, no dramatic realization, only a subtle awareness that your life has been shifting in ways that are not visible on the surface. You think back to recent weeks and notice a pattern you had ignored, how certain things stopped just before they could fully develop, how conversations faded at precise moments, how plans dissolved without a clear reason you could point to. At the time, you called it bad timing, stress, coincidence, or simply life not working out, but now those explanations feel incomplete, like they describe what happened but not why it felt so strangely consistent. There is a memory that returns to you while you are sitting there, a moment you almost forgot, where you were about to make a decision quickly, almost impulsively, but something interrupted your focus just long enough for you to hesitate, and that hesitation changed everything that followed. You did not think much of it then, but now it replays differently, not as regret, but as curiosity, like your attention is slowly being trained to see something you previously overlooked. Even your sleep has begun to feel different, not necessarily worse, but lighter in a way that makes you more aware of waking moments during the night, those quiet seconds where your mind is awake but not thinking, just aware of being there. And in those moments, there is a strange sense that nothing around you is truly disconnected, even if you cannot explain how or why. You start noticing timing more than you used to, how certain thoughts appear right before certain events, how certain emotions rise right before certain decisions, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle repetition that feels too structured to ignore completely. You try to rationalize it, to bring it back into normal explanations, but the feeling remains slightly outside of those explanations, like it exists in the space between what you expected and what actually happens. And even though nothing externally has changed in a way others would notice, internally there is a growing awareness that the pauses, the delays, and the interruptions might not be random at all, but part of something you are only beginning to recognize as it unfolds quietly in real time. By the time the fourth day arrives, the feeling has stopped behaving like something that comes and goes, and instead it feels like something you are learning to live alongside, not because it is overwhelming, but because it is consistent in a way that your usual explanations cannot fully dissolve. You notice it most in the quiet gaps of your day, the seconds between actions, the moments where nothing is required of you, and yet your mind does not fully rest in those gaps the way it used to. You are sitting at a cafe window in the late afternoon, holding a cup of coffee that has already cooled more than you intended to let it, watching people move along the sidewalk in patterns that feel normal and distant at the same time, and there is a subtle disconnect you cannot ignore anymore. It is not that something is wrong in any obvious sense, it is that your attention keeps returning inward even when the world outside is active and unchanged. You think about how often recently you have paused before making simple decisions, like sending a message, replying to someone, or choosing to leave a place, and those pauses no longer feel like hesitation alone, but like something is happening in the space before action. Earlier that day, you were walking through a parking lot when you stopped briefly for no clear reason, just standing still while your phone remained in your hand, and in that moment you felt a strange familiarity, as if you had already been in that exact pause before, even though nothing about it was new. You did not attach meaning to it at first, but now these small interruptions are starting to form a pattern you cannot completely dismiss. There is also the way your thoughts behave differently at night, not louder, not darker, just more persistent, circling the same unresolved questions without urgency but without release, as if they are waiting for something in you to respond differently this time. You remember a recent evening where you almost reached out to someone you had not spoken to in a long time, your hand already on your phone, your mind already forming the first words, but something shifted in you at the last second, a quiet pause that stopped the action without explanation, and the message was never sent. At the time, it felt like nothing, just another moment lost in distraction, but now it returns with a different weight, like a thread in a larger pattern you are only now beginning to notice. Even your perception of timing feels slightly altered, not in a dramatic or confusing way, but in the sense that certain moments seem to arrive just before or just after your expectations, never fully aligning with what you planned, yet never completely random either. And in between all of this, there is still no clear voice, no visible sign, no definitive answer, only a growing awareness that what you once labeled as coincidence may not be as disconnected as it first appeared, and that the space between events might be carrying more meaning than you ever thought to look for. By the fifth day, the experience is no longer something you try to explain to yourself in simple terms, because every explanation you reach for feels like it only covers part of what you are actually noticing. You start your morning in the same way as always, but even the familiar actions feel slightly different, like you are performing them while another part of you is quietly observing from a distance. You are standing in your kitchen again, holding a cup in your hands, and there is a moment where you realize you have not been thinking about the next task for several seconds, which used to feel normal but now feels unusual, as if your mind is learning a new way of being present without fully announcing it. Later, while driving through the same route you take almost every day, you notice something small but unsettling in its consistency, not a change in the environment, but a change in how often your attention pauses at exact moments before something happens. It is never dramatic, never loud, just subtle interruptions in your awareness that feel too precise to completely dismiss, like a pattern forming just beneath the surface of ordinary life. You remember a conversation from a few days ago where you almost said something important, something honest that you quickly held back, and at the time it felt like nothing more than timing or hesitation, but now it returns with a different weight, as if that moment was connected to other moments you did not think were related. There is also a memory of you sitting in your living room late at night, lights dim, phone in your hand, scrolling without focus, and suddenly stopping without knowing why, not because something caught your attention, but because your attention itself seemed to shift away from the need to keep searching. That pause did not bring clarity at the time, only silence, but now that silence feels like it carried more meaning than you realized. As the days continue, you begin to notice how often your internal reactions arrive slightly before external events unfold, not in a way that feels supernatural or dramatic, but in a quiet, almost unnoticed rhythm, like your thoughts and your surroundings are no longer moving completely independently. You try to explain it in practical terms: stress, fatigue, overthinking, routine patterns, but none of those explanations fully settle the feeling, because what you are noticing is not intensity, but consistency across unrelated moments. Even in conversations, there are brief instants where you feel the urge to pause before responding, and when you do pause, something in the exchange subtly shifts, not in outcome, but in awareness, as if you are being guided to notice timing itself rather than just events. At night, when everything is still again, you lie awake with that familiar quiet pressure in your thoughts, but now it feels less like confusion and more like observation, like you are beginning to see the outline of something you were always inside of but never fully recognized before, and even though nothing has been clearly revealed yet, there is an increasing sense that the pattern is not forming randomly, but unfolding in a direction you are only now becoming aware of. By the sixth day, the feeling that has been following you no longer feels like something external that occasionally interrupts your attention, but instead like something integrated into the way you now perceive your own thoughts, subtle enough that you do not question it every second, yet present enough that you cannot fully forget it either. You are sitting by yourself in the late afternoon again, this time in a different place, a small table near a window where people pass by without noticing you, and your coffee is once again colder than you intended, not because you forgot it, but because your attention keeps drifting into pauses you did not plan. There is a quiet sense that your inner world has become more active than your external one, not in a chaotic way, but in a way that feels like observation rather than reaction. Earlier in the day, you had a simple interaction with someone, nothing important on the surface, just a short exchange about plans and timing, but afterward you found yourself replaying a single moment in that conversation where you almost said something different, something more honest, and the fact that you did not say it feels more significant now than it did when it happened. It is not regret, it is more like recognition, as if your awareness is starting to track not only what happens, but what almost happens, and that distinction is beginning to matter more than you expected. Later, while walking through a store aisle, you notice how often you pause slightly before choosing something, even in the smallest decisions, and those pauses no longer feel random or insignificant, because they are beginning to feel familiar, like a rhythm you are unconsciously learning to follow. You think about the past few days and realize how often your attention has been pulled into stillness right before moments of action, as if something in your awareness is stepping in just before things move forward, not stopping you, but slowing you enough to notice. There is a memory that returns to you while you are sitting alone later that evening, a moment where you were about to react emotionally to something that would have normally pulled you into frustration or urgency, but instead you stopped, not because you decided to, but because something in you simply did not continue the reaction, and that interruption changed the entire direction of the moment. At the time, you did not assign meaning to it, but now it feels like part of the same pattern you have been quietly observing. Even your sense of time feels slightly different now, not in a way that is distorted, but in a way where certain moments feel spaced differently than before, like the gaps between events are becoming more noticeable than the events themselves. At night, when the world finally becomes quiet again, you find yourself no longer searching for immediate answers in the same way, because something about the repetition of these subtle interruptions has shifted your focus from outcomes to timing itself, and although nothing around you has clearly changed in a visible or dramatic way, there is a growing awareness that what you once called coincidence is becoming harder to separate from something more structured, something you are still in the middle of understanding rather than concluding. By the 7th day, the pattern you have been noticing is no longer something you try to catch in real time, because it has already settled into the background of how you now experience your thoughts, like a quiet layer underneath everything you do. You wake up earlier than usual without a clear reason, not because you are anxious or excited, but because your mind seems to become active before your body fully adjusts to the day, and for a few seconds after opening your eyes you just lie there staring at the ceiling, aware that something in your awareness feels slightly reorganized compared to how it used to be. The first few minutes of your morning carry a strange clarity that does not feel emotional, but observational, as if you are seeing your own routine from a slightly different angle than before. As you go through the day, you notice that the pauses you once thought were random now appear in a more consistent rhythm, especially right before decisions that normally would have been automatic, like replying to a message, choosing a direction while walking, or deciding whether to continue or stop a thought. There is a moment while you are sitting alone again, this time in the early evening, where you open your phone, then stop before doing anything with it, and instead of feeling distracted, you feel a calm hesitation that does not demand explanation, only attention. That feeling is not new anymore, but what is new is your recognition of how often it appears at exactly the same threshold moments in your day. You begin to remember how, in the past, you would have dismissed these pauses as fatigue or overthinking, but now they feel too precise to belong only to those explanations. Earlier that day, while walking outside, you passed a place you have passed many times before, yet for a brief second your attention shifted in a way that made the environment feel slightly unfamiliar, not because anything changed externally, but because your awareness did. It passed quickly, but it left behind a sense that your perception itself is becoming more sensitive to timing, not just events. You think back over the past week and realize how often certain thoughts appeared just before certain situations unfolded, not in a predictive way you can prove, but in a subtle alignment that you only notice after it happens. At night, when everything slows down again, you lie in bed and realize that the silence does not feel empty anymore in the same way it used to, because it is no longer just absence of sound, but presence of awareness, and within that awareness, you start to feel that the repetition you have been experiencing is not random enough to ignore, yet not clear enough to fully define, leaving you in a space where understanding is still forming rather than completed, and where every new pause seems to carry the same quiet implication that something is continuing to unfold just beyond the edge of what you can immediately explain. By the 8th day, there is a shift in how you relate to the pauses you have been experiencing, because they no longer feel like interruptions in your life, but instead like something your awareness is beginning to anticipate before it even happens. You are sitting alone in your usual space in the late afternoon, light fading slightly through the window, and your phone is resting face up on the table without any urgency pulling you toward it, which in itself feels different from how you used to behave even a week ago. There is a quiet moment where you realize you are not actively searching for distraction in the same way anymore, and that realization does not come with excitement or fear, but with a calm recognition that something in your internal rhythm has changed. Earlier that day, while walking through a familiar street, you noticed how your attention briefly slowed just before you turned a corner you have turned many times before, and in that small delay, there was a sense of familiarity that felt deeper than the physical location itself, as if your awareness was already slightly ahead of your movement. You did not question it in the moment, but later it returned to you, not as an event, but as a feeling that carried more weight when revisited in silence. You begin to remember how often recently you have experienced similar moments, where something in you pauses just before a decision, just before a reaction, or just before an action that would normally happen without thought, and instead of seeing those pauses as random hesitation, you are now starting to recognize them as something consistent in timing, even if you cannot fully define what that consistency means. There was also a moment in the middle of the night a few days ago where you woke up briefly without any clear reason, and in that half-awake state you felt a stillness that did not feel empty, but aware, like your mind was briefly observing itself rather than generating thoughts, and although you fell back asleep quickly, that sensation stayed with you longer than expected. During the day that followed, you noticed how certain small events seemed to align with your thoughts in ways that felt too specific to ignore, not as predictions, but as subtle overlaps between what you were thinking and what was happening around you. You try to explain it in ordinary terms, and sometimes you still do, but those explanations are beginning to feel less complete than the experience itself. Even in conversations, you notice brief internal pauses where your response forms more slowly than usual, and in those moments, something in your awareness feels like it is watching the space before words are spoken rather than the words themselves. As the day ends again and you find yourself alone in quiet surroundings, you realize that the sense of repetition you have been tracking is not intensifying in a dramatic way, but becoming clearer in its structure, like a pattern that does not announce itself loudly, but reveals itself through consistency over time, leaving you in a state where you are no longer simply moving through days, but quietly observing how each moment seems to connect to the next in a way you are still in the process of understanding. By the 9th day, the awareness you have been developing no longer feels like something that appears occasionally during pauses in your routine, because it now feels more continuous, like a quiet background layer that stays present even while you are fully engaged in daily activities. You wake up in the morning and the first thing you notice is not a thought or an emotion, but a kind of stillness that feels different from sleep, as if your mind is already slightly aligned with something before you even begin thinking about the day. You go through your morning routine in the same physical way as always, but internally there is a subtle shift in how you experience each action, like you are not only performing them, but also observing the space around them at the same time. Later in the day, while sitting in a familiar place, you notice how often your attention now naturally pauses before certain thoughts fully form, and those pauses no longer feel accidental or random, but increasingly familiar, as if they are part of a structure you are gradually learning to recognize without fully understanding it yet. There is a moment when you are walking outside and you suddenly stop for a fraction of a second before continuing, not because anything physically requires you to stop, but because something in your awareness briefly separates itself from the flow of movement, and in that brief separation, you feel an unusual sense of clarity that does not come with emotion, but with recognition. You begin to reflect on how many times recently similar pauses have occurred, not as isolated events, but as repeating patterns across different situations, conversations, and decisions, and while you still cannot define what connects them, you can no longer ignore that they feel connected. Earlier that evening, you find yourself sitting quietly in your room, phone in hand, not scrolling, not searching, just holding it, and noticing how still your thoughts have become compared to how they used to race in similar moments in the past. There is a memory that returns without effort, a moment from days ago when you were about to react quickly to something small, but instead paused without intention, and that pause changed the entire direction of how you responded, leaving you calmer than you expected afterward. At the time, you did not consider it significant, but now it feels like another piece in a larger sequence of similar experiences that seem to repeat with slight variations. Even your sense of timing continues to feel subtly different, not in a way that disturbs you, but in a way that makes you more aware of the space between actions, as if the gaps themselves are beginning to carry information you did not notice before. At night, when everything becomes quiet again, you lie still and realize that your mind is no longer trying to force immediate explanations for what you are experiencing, because explanations no longer feel as urgent as observation itself, and in that shift, there is a growing sense that you are no longer simply reacting to life as it happens, but slowly becoming aware of a pattern that reveals itself only through patience and repetition over time. By the 10th day, the awareness you have been living with no longer feels like something that appears in isolated moments, because it now feels like a constant undercurrent beneath your normal thinking, subtle enough that you can still function through your day, yet persistent enough that you cannot fully return to how things used to feel. You wake up and immediately notice that your thoughts are not rushing forward the way they once did, but instead seem to form more slowly, almost as if there is a space between each thought that you are now capable of noticing. As you move through your morning routine, making coffee, preparing for the day, checking small details of your schedule, there is a quiet sense that your attention is no longer fully absorbed by the surface of actions, but is also watching the space around them. Later, while sitting near a window in the late afternoon, you notice how often your mind now naturally pauses before reacting to something simple, like a message notification or a passing thought about something you need to do, and those pauses no longer feel like hesitation or distraction, but something structured, as if your awareness is adjusting itself in real time to something you cannot yet fully define. There is a moment during the day when you are walking outside and you suddenly stop for just a second before continuing forward, and in that brief stillness, you feel a clarity that does not come with emotion or analysis, but with recognition, like your attention is briefly stepping outside of the flow of events to observe the flow itself. You begin to realize that these moments are not isolated anymore, because they have been repeating across different days, different environments, and different mental states, always appearing in slightly different forms but carrying the same quality of interruption followed by awareness. Earlier that evening, you sit alone in your room with very little external distraction, and instead of feeling restless like you normally would in silence, you notice that the silence itself feels structured, almost organized, as if it has depth rather than emptiness. You think back over the past several days and recognize how many times you have experienced small internal breaks in your reactions, moments where you were about to think, respond, or decide, and something in you paused without effort, and that pause changed the way the moment unfolded. At the time, you did not give those moments much meaning, but now they begin to connect in your mind like points, forming a pattern that you are slowly learning to trace. Even your emotional responses feel slightly different now, not stronger or weaker, but more observed than automatic, as if you are no longer fully inside every reaction in the same way you used to be. At night, when everything becomes quiet again, you lie still and notice that your mind is no longer searching for immediate explanations, because the experience itself has shifted from something you are trying to understand into something you are quietly witnessing, and in that witnessing, there is a growing awareness that what once felt like random timing is beginning to feel like a continuous pattern unfolding gradually over time. By the 11th day, the experience you have been moving through no longer feels like a series of separate moments you are trying to interpret, because it now feels like a continuous awareness that stays with you even as you switch between different parts of your daily life. You wake up in the morning and there is already a sense that your thoughts are not starting from zero, but continuing from something that was already in motion before you became fully aware of it. As you lie still for a few seconds before getting out of bed, you notice how quiet your mind has become in comparison to how it used to feel in the past, not empty, but organized in a way that allows space between thoughts. You go through your morning routine, making coffee, getting ready, checking simple tasks, but even in those familiar actions there is a growing awareness that your attention is no longer fully consumed by what you are doing, because part of you is also observing how and when you are doing it. Later in the day, while sitting alone near a window again, you notice how often your internal reactions now pause just before they complete themselves, like your thoughts are forming more slowly at the final moment before becoming decisions, and those pauses feel consistent enough that you can no longer dismiss them as coincidence or distraction. There is a moment during the afternoon when you are walking outside and you feel that familiar interruption again, a brief stillness that appears right before you change direction slightly, and in that stillness there is no emotion or urgency, only a quiet sense of recognition that something in your awareness is active before your actions fully follow. You begin to think back over the past several days, and instead of seeing isolated experiences, you now see a pattern of repeated internal pauses, moments where reactions did not complete in the way they normally would have, and those incomplete reactions seem to have shaped your experience of time itself in subtle ways. Earlier in the evening, you sit in a quiet room with no distractions, and instead of feeling the need to fill the silence, you notice that the silence itself feels structured, almost as if it has depth and layers that your awareness can now perceive more clearly than before. You remember specific moments from recent days where you were about to respond quickly, either emotionally or mentally, but something interrupted that automatic flow just long enough for your response to change or dissolve entirely, and at the time those moments felt insignificant, but now they appear connected in a way that feels increasingly difficult to ignore. Even your perception of your own thoughts has shifted, because you are no longer fully immersed in every reaction as it happens, but instead there is a growing space where you observe the formation of those reactions before they fully take shape. At night, when everything becomes still again, you lie down and realize that you are no longer trying to force explanations for what is happening, because the experience has moved beyond explanation and into observation, and in that observation there is a quiet awareness that what once seemed like random timing is now revealing itself through repetition, consistency, and a structure that continues to unfold without needing your immediate understanding. By the 12th day, the experience you have been living with no longer feels like something that is developing in separate stages, because it now feels like a continuous awareness that simply deepens rather than changes, as if you have been moving through the same invisible structure from the beginning without realizing how consistent it has been. You wake up in the morning with a calm stillness that feels different from tiredness, not heavy, not light, just present, like your mind is already in a state of observation before it fully engages with the world around you. As you lie there for a few moments before getting up, you notice that your thoughts are not rushing forward the way they used to, but instead appear more spaced out, with quiet gaps between them that you can now clearly recognize rather than overlook. You go through your morning routine in the same familiar environment, preparing coffee, checking small details, moving through tasks you have done countless times before, but there is a subtle shift in how you experience each action, because you are no longer only inside the action itself, but also aware of the timing behind how each action begins and ends. Later in the day, while sitting alone near a window again, you notice that the pauses in your awareness are no longer surprising to you, because they have become consistent enough that your mind now expects them before they arrive, and in that expectation there is a quiet recognition that something about your internal rhythm has stabilized into a pattern. There is a moment when you are walking outside and you feel that familiar stillness appear once more just before you change direction, and this time instead of questioning it or analyzing it, you simply notice it as part of the flow, as if your awareness is learning to observe without resistance. You begin to reflect on how many times over the past several days your reactions have been interrupted just before completion, not in a disruptive way, but in a way that altered your experience of the moment itself, and those interruptions no longer feel random, because they have repeated too often across different situations to be dismissed as coincidence. Earlier in the evening, you sit quietly in a familiar space with very little external distraction, and instead of feeling the need to fill the silence, you realize that the silence itself has become something you can sit within without discomfort, almost as if it now carries structure rather than emptiness. You think back through the sequence of recent days and notice how often you were about to react, respond, or decide quickly, only to find that something in you paused just before the action fully formed, and those pauses, which once felt insignificant, now appear as consistent points of interruption that shape the way each moment unfolded. Even your emotional responses feel slightly different now, not because they have disappeared or intensified, but because there is a growing space between what happens and how you react to it, and in that space you are becoming aware of the formation of your own thoughts rather than only their results. At night, when everything becomes still again, you lie down and realize that you are no longer trying to explain what you are experiencing in immediate terms, because explanation has been replaced by observation, and in that observation there is a quiet understanding that what once felt like scattered moments is now revealing itself as a continuous pattern that has been unfolding steadily across time. By the 13th day, there is no longer any sense that you are trying to figure something out in real time, because the experience you have been moving through has settled into something quieter and more integrated, like a layer of awareness that now exists alongside everything you do without needing to announce itself. You wake up in the morning and there is a calm familiarity in how your thoughts begin, not rushing, not scattered, but arriving in a measured sequence that feels different from how your mind used to operate before this entire period began. As you lie still for a few moments before starting your day, you notice that silence no longer feels like emptiness, because it now carries a kind of structure that your awareness can recognize without effort. You go through your morning routine in the same environment, making coffee, preparing for the day, moving through familiar actions, but there is a subtle shift in how present you are within each moment, because you are no longer only focused on what you are doing, but also aware of how your attention moves through each step. Later in the day, while sitting in a quiet place near a window, you realize that the pauses you once noticed as interruptions are no longer surprising, because they now feel like a consistent part of your internal rhythm, appearing before certain thoughts, decisions, or reactions without warning but with increasing familiarity. There is a moment when you are walking outside and you feel that brief stillness again just before you change direction, but this time there is no resistance or analysis attached to it, only observation, as if you are simply witnessing how your awareness and your actions are beginning to align in ways that were not obvious before. You think back over the past sequence of days and recognize how many times your reactions were quietly interrupted at the edge of forming, and how those interruptions gradually changed the way you experience situations that once felt automatic. Even your emotional responses now feel different, not because they are absent or heightened, but because there is more space between what happens and how you respond to it, and in that space you are beginning to notice the formation of thought itself rather than only its outcome. At night, when everything becomes quiet once again, you lie down and realize that you are no longer searching for immediate meaning in what you have experienced, because meaning no longer feels like something to chase, but something that slowly reveals itself through continuity and repetition. And in that realization there is a quiet sense that what once felt like scattered moments has now formed into a complete and ongoing awareness that continues even in silence.